Welcome to another episode of Wellness Curated. This is your host, Anshu Bahanda. And as you know, I present you with ideas, trends, tools, and techniques which will help you lead a healthier, happier, more hopeful life. This season, we're focusing on social well-being. And as COVID showed us, we're all social animals. Our topic for today's discussion is social anxiety, specifically in children. Now, we know that it can be heartbreaking for parents when their children are going through social anxiety. Social anxiety disorder or social phobia is when someone's afraid of being watched and judged by others. And it often starts between the age of 8 and 15 in kids. And this fear can make it hard for people to do things at school, at work, and lead their daily lives. We have with us today a very special guest, Jonathan Alderson, who is an innovator of autism treatments. Now, he wrote a book called Challenging the Myths of Autism. He's the founder of Thrive Guide, a platform created to help families with children who have autism. And Jonathan has worked with over 2,000 children and their families for more than 20 years. Welcome to the chat, Jonathan, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Anshu. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
You're welcome. Now, Jonathan, can I start by asking you to explain social anxiety to us? And in your experience, how does it present itself differently in children?
Sure. Well, you gave a pretty good definition at the beginning, but I think that a good place for your listeners who might not have come across social anxiety directly to start is to, first of all, think about a time in your own life when you felt maybe a bit shy. It might be when you were going to meet someone new, maybe a long, long time ago when you're going on a date, for example, or you might have been asked to stand up by a teacher in a classroom to answer a question, and you had the feeling that everyone was watching you and everyone was judging you. So now if you can think of a feeling like that, now multiply that feeling by 10 times or even 100 times, the feeling that everyone's watching you and judging you and shaming you. And then you could just start to understand a little bit about what people with social anxiety are experiencing. But for people with this disorder, with this really debilitating experience, it's an ongoing and pervasive fear that isn't just restricted to a single time or a single event, but it's something that fills their mind, their thoughts throughout the day, that they might even be anticipating weeks in advance an event. And it might be an event like just going into a restaurant to have a meal. And so this fear of being in social situations really starts to get in the way of them being able to do just basic daily tasks like taking a bus, getting in a cab, or a taxi, or going to meet friends or going grocery shopping. And so this is where we have the sense of social anxiety disorder. And in its most extreme cases, Anshu, it would be people who just stay at home and almost refuse to go outside for the fear of, as you said, sort of being judged or humiliated socially.
I have some friends, not a lot, but I have some friends where I've seen this. And what I find is when you force them to get out, they actually enjoy themselves. But it's that process of taking the first step, which is hard. So I want to ask you something. Is there a way of preventing this in a child? Is there a way that, can we get to it before it becomes an issue? Just like with dogs. I mean, you're going to use the example of dogs. You socialize a dog when it's young so that it's used to being around other dogs. You socialize children when they're young. You take them to all these classes. Does that help?
Well, The short answer is yes and no in this sense, which is you're sort of looking at what might cause it, is what you're sort of angling at a little bit. And if we believe that it's caused by simply the environment, then you're right that there's a possibility that if you raise a child in a particular way, in a particular environment, that you may be able to, in quotes, prevent that. But it's not so clear cut as that, because there are children and young adults and adults who are raised in wonderful families, very loving families, and where there wasn't necessarily an acute event that led them to feel this way. Social anxiety disorder, Anshu, if we just step back for a moment, let me just say that, first of all, it's among what we call a spectrum disorder. And so there's really quite a wide range of the functioning and ability and degree to which people would suffer from a social anxiety disorder. There's a very broad range in the way that it might be manifest. And so, social anxiety, people who experience more intense social anxiety are prone to feeling sort of like nervous and anxious, as I said, for weeks in advance. And just to go on a rational level, to appeal to the rational mind and say, hey, there's kind of nothing to be worried about. Let's just go out and try. You were mentioning some friends that you might sort of just get them going, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have a diagnosis of social anxiety, it's really just not that simple. And in part, it's because the fears that they have are, in quotes, irrational. And meaning they might feel, if I go grocery shopping, everyone's going to look at what I'm wearing and everyone's going to laugh at me, and it will be highly embarrassing. Now, the rational fact is probably very few people are going to be watching you because they are also shopping for groceries, or they're focused on their own children, something like that. And yet they have this intense fear and they're very convinced. So just telling them or talking to them or forcing them, if you will, to do that often backfires. I'll give you just a quick example. I worked with a 21-year-old woman several years ago, and I remember how much she perseverated thinking about her brother's upcoming wedding in the summer. It was 3 months away when I was working with her. And she talked over and over and over with her mother, with her brother, with me, with other people in her family, about who was going to be sitting at the table with her at the wedding. Now, this is, again, 3 months away, but she would play out scenarios on, well, what will they say? And what should I say if they say that? And what if they ask me what I've been doing and I haven't been working and they're going to laugh at me? And there really wasn't an opportunity for anyone. I certainly tried a little bit to rationalize with her. So that's not really an approach that we take. I will get into, if you'd like, how we approach it. But one thing that can help, that you're talking about a little bit when you say just to get them going, is something that we call exposure therapy or systematic desensitization. And so this is a psychology from psychology. It's an approach that psychologists use where you might have someone just start a little bit, not appealing to their logic necessarily, but more to their senses. Where for this young lady, for example, one thing I did is I had her sit in the comfort of her home, in the comfort of a place where she was not at the wedding. And I had her just imagine, as she already was, but I had her imagine a conversation that someone would have with her. So we sat together, but I had her deeply relax. So I had her take
Right.
deep breaths. Again, she was in a safe space. She was in her home and just with me. Her mother was in the other room, so it gave her comfort. And I asked her to imagine a conversation. And we actually, if you will, went there. We actually, in her mind and in a real conversation, we went into a conversation that might occur. And so I would say, what do you imagine someone might ask you? And she said, oh, they might ask me if I have a job and if I'm employed. And I said, okay, would it be okay with you if I was that person for a moment? We're right here and you can stop at any time. So she has control. And again, we started to have this conversation. And at each successive back and forth, if you will, I would check in with her and say, how are you feeling now? What's your anxiety level now? And then if she said it's pretty high, I would encourage her to relax her physical body. And on we went through an entire conversation. And that's called systematic desensitization, just exposing her to little bits of what she's fearing.
Right. And taking it to another level from there, if you
That's
keep
right.
doing something, you get desensitized to it a little
That's
bit.
right. Yes.
It
That's
becomes
right.
part
Yes.
of
For
your system.
example, for example, we might set the table in the home, again in her own home. We're months away from the wedding, but in her own home we might set the table along with her in a way that looks a little bit more like a wedding, a bit more formal. We might even have her put on the dress or something similar that she might wear to the wedding, and then sit with her again in her own living room, with someone familiar, with a therapist, and then again have that same conversation about being employed, imagining that you're at the wedding. And so this is sort of bit by bit by bit. This isn't a severe case I'm referring to.
Right. So the cases I'm referring to were not as severe as that, but
Right.
but they recognize, that they have an issue with being in public, with being with lots of people. So
Yes,
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
and one of the elements, Anshu, that you're bringing up, which is very important, is almost 100% of people that suffer from social anxiety disorder are aware of it. They are aware of
Yes.
it, that they can recognize it. They
Absolutely.
know that they're feeling this way.
Yes.
They know often why. And for many people, they can also understand that it's somewhat irrational. I've had conversations with people in this situation, young the teenagers, who will say, I know it doesn't make sense, but that's how they preface the sentence. So they're sort of aware of the depth of their irrationality around it, and yet it's a real fear that's very, very deeply embedded. You mentioned in the intro that it occurs a little bit later in childhood, and I know we're talking about children right now. So let me just say that it seems more prevalent in terms of sort of research and facts in females than males. Is more
Oh,
prevalent in females
really?
than males.
Oh, okay. I
Yes,
didn't know that. That's
yes.
interesting.
And this is especially true when we look at the demographics of it in adolescents and young adults. In other words, that's where you find it more prevalent in women. Some researchers have suggested that this is in part due to our Western society's focus, and maybe even globally, on how young females look, and also how they
All the
behave
more
in a
so
way
with
that
social media now, all the more so.
that's right. Exactly. Yes. The rates of anxiety in young teenagers and young women that have led, unfortunately, to in some cases, suicide or extreme self-isolation,
Oh
not
my
willing to come out
gosh.
of bedrooms. So there's a dynamic that's happening potentially on social media, and this idea of extreme examination by people, a young teenager who posts a picture of themselves, maybe even just on a family holiday or something very quite neutral. The selfie, looking at yourself and taking a picture, but posting it. And within seconds, people are giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And in, worst cases, making comments like, oh, you should get a new haircut, or, look at your crooked teeth. And this extreme examination can certainly trigger and lead to a hyper self-examination, which starts to get at part of the root of the social anxiety, Anshu, is that I have a fear of others judging me and others shaming me, but within my own mind, I also could be potentially very, very self-critical.
Jonathan, how would we see signs in a child that they might be experiencing social anxiety? So, say they haven't expressed it yet. Are there certain signs to look out for?
Yes, very much. So there are, for example, physical signs. When someone is experiencing anxiety, you would have extra perspiration. You would perspire. right? Sweating, someone who's nervous and has big wet marks literally under their arms. There is a tension in the body that you could see. You know the term frozen with fear. So someone, there are cases where someone is walking to catch a taxi or walking to go out, and they literally freeze. They stop, and in their mind they're going over the fear situation, and they freeze, and they won't move. They'll just stand and maybe stare forward. These are extreme examples. So their heart palpitations is another one. So they're physiological experiences someone has of fear. In terms of an adult or a parent being able to recognize that their child may have some social anxieties, one of the most common ones is just avoidance of social situations. So let's say you say to your child, "Oh, we're going over to Uncle Bill's on Sunday for lunch." And the child starts to make up reasons why they can't go. "Oh, I have a lot of homework," or "Oh, I'm just going to stay home," or "I'm tired. I have a tummy ache. I'm not able to go." And you're thinking to yourself, "Oh, that's a bit odd because my daughter typically loves to go to her aunt and uncle's." And that's a change in behavior. Now, if it's a one-time thing, that doesn't mean social anxiety. But if you start to see a pattern of social avoidance and the child not wanting to go out or wanting to stay home, these would be typical signals that there's maybe something going on that needs to be addressed.
And do you feel like some children are better equipped to deal with social anxiety than others? And how does this difference come in?
Well, again, this brings us back to sort of what might be causing it and what's going on in the physical body. So it's a very interesting question, and thank you for asking it. You know, it's sort of your question in some ways is aligned with my approach to autism, because if we agree that every autistic child is a unique child, there's no one autistic child that's similar to another. In fact, there's an expression they say, if you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism. In other words, there's a real range. And we, by extension, again, every human being is unique in the world. And this is very important to understand because when we think about coping mechanisms, then the answer is yes. If there's a wide range of how social anxiety manifests, there's also a wide range of what our abilities are to deal with it, right? So for example, in autism, I'll just do a contrast. Almost 100% of the children are recommended to do what's called ABA, or applied behavioral analysis treatment. And yet even the research shows that it works for about 50% of the children, but we seem resistance, or our healthcare system seems resistant to providing personalized, kind of individualized care. We sort of say all children with autism should do applied behavioral analysis. So now, to answer your question, are some people better equipped to handle social anxiety than others? The answer is yes, because there are studies looking at this and why some people can manage stress better than others. Why can some people smoke all their lives and not get cancer, while the person who's never smoked gets cancer? And research are, they're really busy trying to figure out these differences. My guess is the answer is we're just all different, period. But this doesn't mean that we couldn't be more smart about our own personal individuality and constitution and how we approach stress in life. I'll give you an example. If we look at the human genome, right, we've decoded it, right? So you can now you can get a little swab and go for, in the United States, we have a program called 23andMe. I think it's global now, but you can have your DNA sequence. And doctors can run this through some software now and actually determine which class of drugs work in your body and which don't. So, for example, I'm coming to your question of differences. So, for example, if you have depression, for example, there's a wide range, about six, seven different types, classes of drugs that you could be asked to try: SSRIs, SNRIs, for example. And typically, a doctor would just trial one and say, "Well, let's try this and see how it goes." But in modern medicines, we can look at your genetics and actually determine in advance which one might work for you better, which type of drug would work in your specific unique metabolism or not. So coming back to social anxiety, most doctors agree that social anxiety is an epigenetic phenomenon. So that means it's part genetics and part environment.
Right.
So there's likely different triggers in the environment, like stress, diet, exercise, relationships around you, right? And so it turns out that each individual person, each child that I work with, that you've been talking about, yes, they have their own unique set of ability to manage stress or inability to manage stress. And they have their each own set of environmental factors that trigger or don't trigger. So the short answer to your question is, when we're going to help a child with social anxiety, we want to look at all of that individuality, all of that real differences and that each child brings to the table, and we try and identify what the strengths of that child is. That's sort of what we call a strengths-based approach. So some children are very good at articulating and being able to self-reflect cognitively. Some children aren't. Other children are quite able, though, to take deep breaths and relax their body and do some yoga, let's say, and go in a direction of physically calming themselves, even though their mind is spinning. And other children respond very well to comfort and adults leaning in and feeling, that they can accept the nurturing. Some reject it. So really looking out, are some kids more able to manage it than others? I would argue, yes, very much so, but there's a wide range.
Thank you, Jonathan. Um, and I believe that approach actually going forward should be used for all children, not just in cases of social anxiety. That learning is
Absolutely,
very
yes.
unique. But tell me, how would social anxiety impact a child's learning and social development and other development?
Yes, well, I mean, the impact, it can be quite great. I mean, when we think about a child's learning and social development, it's exactly what you might imagine, that the fear that the child is feeling literally stops them. Again, sort of frozen. It limits them from being able to participate in large or sometimes even small groups. So these children will refuse to go to school in an extreme case, or in a less extreme case, they may go to school, but they may choose to sit alone at lunchtime, for example. They may choose to not attend birthday parties or go out to see to the cinema with friends. So they may not be able to participate on sports teams, for example. Basically, they can self-isolate and avoid the possibility of being judged or humiliated or being left out. They don't want to face the possibility of not being chosen to be part of a game, for example, at a birthday party. So it's quite sad in this way. And so it has a huge impact on a child's self-esteem and on their social development. And of course, all of this is no different for a child with special needs, although perhaps arguably almost worse, since most special needs, students already face social stigma and social communication challenges. So when you put social anxiety on top of that, it's sort of double. And I'd just like to mention that the early years, I think most people understand now that early years development, in other words, the development that occurs, social development, maturation, language development, communication, which happens in the early years from 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. If you have a child who is really resisting socializing because of these fears, it absolutely can impact and lead to sort of lifelong challenges with socializing.
Right. So in that case, what would you say can help? What strategies would help? Say you're noticing that a child is resisting socializing as early on as 3 or 4. And, I believe the first 6 years are and a lot of developmental psychologists will tell you that the first 6 years are very, very important in a child's life. What can you do? Would a play-based approach help? What else will help?
Yes. So thank you for asking the question, because you're sort of focusing on, let's say, at first, quite young children, and the way that we might approach young children is different than how you might approach a young adolescent or even an adult. I'll say that probably one of the most common approaches to social anxiety in our medicalized society is medication. And so I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not here prescribing in any way if someone's listening. But common drugs that we know, like Zoloft and Paxil, these are medications that are used for anxiety disorders broadly, including social disorders. But of course, when you're talking about a 3 or 4-year-old, that's not typically something that we would go to immediately. You mentioned play therapy. I think one thing that we want to avoid, and this is really important when you're understanding what kinds of things can help, one thing that we don't want to do is to put pressure to
Right.
socialize. So you don't want to take a child who's clinging to you. If you're talking about a 3 or 4-year-old who's literally physically clinging to you. For example, imagine you're in the car, driven over to a family function. You go into the back seat of the car to get your child out of the car seat, and they're resisting, they're pushing away, they're screaming, and they're holding on to you. Taking that child and physically forcing them to go in as they're screaming or resisting is typically not helpful. Why? Because you can cause trauma. You can cause trauma events where a child has this memory now of being forced into a situation not comfortable in. So what does help in that situation? Well, I would suggest that the very first thing that you want to do is help the physical body to calm down. So, Anshu, again, working with children with autism, where there's not always a way to rationalize, to have a conversation, because many of the children are not able to communicate in a neurotypical way. What I teach the therapy teams that I work with is to first address the physical manifestation of the fear, even though it's driven in at a mental level, at a cognitive level. So that those heart palpitations, the perspiration, the panting, breathing, the tension, what we do is we would first help the child to relax. So in the example I gave you, I'd open the back door of the car, I'd see the child is resisting, is having fear. I might take as many as 5 or 10 minutes delay before going into the social event and help my child just to feel calm and relaxed. So almost the opposite reaction than many well-intentioned parents take, which is, again, is to say, oh, come on, sweetheart, stop fussing, let's go, we've got to get inside. And the parent gets a little bit agitated. The parent gets frustrated. And so now we have two agitated people, a little child and a parent. It doesn't help. So what do? We teach the parents, or the therapist in this case, to take a deep breath, to take a step back, to slow things down, to relax your body, and help that child to also do the same thing. And so it sounds trite, but to take deep breaths, or to pause for a moment, to look at something like a tree or the sky, or to look at a book, to get your mind off of going into this social event, to distract and let the body calm down. Now, I want to say something that's really important here. When our fear is triggered, and Anshu, I know that you've done study in many, many areas of health. That's one of your specialties. And on this on your podcast, and you've spoken with many different professionals, and you know about the fear response. You know about when adrenaline kicks in. And what science tells us is when our adrenaline is surging and we have fear, that our frontal lobes, our logic, is shut down. Not entirely, but a little bit. And so, ironically, in some way, the irrational fear that someone's having of, I'm going to go in the party and everyone's going to laugh at me. When we try and rationalize with someone in that fear state, they're literally, the brain is not able to hear that rationale. Okay. And so this is why rationalizing in the moment of fear is usually not that helpful. So going back to calming down a little bit, even a little bit, calming down the physical body, pausing, slowing things down. What this does is it actually allows the frontal lobes or the logic to re-engage. And so when we see a child 6, 7, 8, or 9 years old, 3 or 4 years old, when we see them calm down a little bit, maybe they're held against your chest, maybe they're doing some deep breathing, maybe you've distracted them with a book. When their physical body's calm, then we can start to have a little conversation and appeal to the rational mind and say, hey, I'm going to be holding your hand. You'll be okay. I promise you that your uncle is waiting to see you and he loves you very much, and reminding them that they'll be safe and okay. But first, we have to get the brain receptive to that. Does that make sense?
It does. And would you say that that's applicable to a neurotypical child as well as a child with, say, autism or special needs? Is it the
Very
same
much,
way to
yes.
approach them? Okay.
Yes, because we're talking about human physiology now. We're simply talking again about when the fear response is happening, what's happening in your brain. And your brain really isn't receptive to thinking logically about a situation when you're in that fear response. So yes, I would say that this could be an idea for really any adult, child, teenager experiencing high levels of fear and anxiety, is to not do the cognitive mental work that probably needs to be done when you're in that duress. First, relax. And that's why, going back to the first part of our conversation, where I talked about systematic desensitization as one approach to helping, is that we do that in a very safe environment. We do that, it could be in a clinic, it could be in your home, where that fear response isn't triggered as high because you're not in the situation. Therefore, the brain literally is receptive to talking it through. So besides medication, you asked what are some common strategies and things to help. Besides medication, probably one of the number one approaches currently in the field of psychology is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. You will have heard of that, of course. And it's a talk therapy, if you will, a form of psychotherapy, CBT, where you're helping people identify beliefs that they hold and limiting ideas and concepts that they're holding on to that restrict their behavior and limit their work. Another thing that's used is hypnotherapy. So not hypnosis like you see on a stage or a magic show, but legitimate clinical hypnotherapy. And again, it involves deep relaxation, and it involves trying to access deeper parts of the mind when it's not under stress, in order to unlock and be able to see different dynamics, in some cases trauma, that might have led to these feelings of irrational anxiety. There is one other approach, and I'll mention, I don't know, Anshu, have you heard of EFT, or emotional freedom technique, or what's called
Yes,
tapping?
yes, tapping. Yes, yes.
So this would be an approach that many people with anxiety, social anxiety disorder, have used to really have great relief. It sort of circumvents in some way the cognitive mind and goes right into the neurology to release trauma, blocked energy, and so on and so forth. So EFT, or tapping, is something that you could do with a child in their mid-age, sort of 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and all the way through adolescence.
Jonathan, I would love you to show us some tapping points, actually, that parents can use on their children or teach their children to do when they start feeling anxious, or beforehand
Yes,
to prepare themselves.
right. Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm not a tapping specialist myself, although I could go through the points, starting with we would tap on the side of the hand here, or on the side of the hand here. And then we would go to over the eyebrows. We would go under the eyes. We would go under the nose, under the chin, under the armpit. And
Okay.
but you would really want to be working with someone that teaches tapping. I think An
Right.
idea I can share, Anshu, that's very important and really critical to the conversation we're having. And that is, while you tap on different trigger points or energy points in the body, a big part of emotional freedom technique is what you say out loud. And
Okay.
one of the
So it's
key
setting your
phrases,
intent and phrase, letting your senses hear it.
really having a different conversation with your cognitive mind. So there's obviously the physical body and the fear that we might be feeling, but there's also the thoughts, and the fear is driven, again, that thought of what's going to happen at the wedding. Are they going to ask me this question? That's not going to be good. So you have a whole narrative happening in your mind, in your thinking. And that's what needs to really change. And so when you're doing tapping, a key sentence that you're saying is, even though I'm feeling fear about the upcoming wedding, or even though I'm feeling fear about playing with my friend at the birthday party, I accept myself anyway. So just think about that sentence for a moment. Even though I can't seem to get myself out the front door to go to have tea or coffee with my friend, I accept myself anyway. Now, why is this critical? Anshu, it's because people with this fear are often, remember I said at the beginning, they themselves are often very hypercritical, right? And maybe our society is teaching us to do that. We don't have to analyze our society, but again, the selfie generation, or looking hyper at how white are my teeth, and how nice is my hair, and so on and so forth. That idea of being very, very self-critical. It's common that someone with social anxiety disorder is also very self-critical. I'm not tall enough. I'm not smart enough. I can't do this well enough. People don't like me. I don't know how to have a conversation. And that self-judgment, that self-criticism is really something that layers on top of, like a judgment sandwich, if you will. They feel that other people are judging them, but they're also judging themselves. And so when we look at EFT or even cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the underlying goals is to help the person feel more comfortable with themselves. And this is an answer you asked earlier. What could a parent begin to do? And is play therapy helpful? You asked earlier. I think any modality of an adult helping a child learn to be more accepting of themselves, comfortable with themselves, is helpful. And so not just telling a child, hey, you're okay, but really helping them feel that they're okay within themselves. In other words, it's one thing for me to say, hey, you're a nice person, but it's another to help you believe that you are a nice person. And so this is really I think at the crux of what we're doing is, how do you help someone ultimately love themselves, Anshu? How do you help? How do we love ourselves? How do we love ourselves? An adult who is in their midlife, maybe they're struggling in their marriage, maybe they're not feeling great at work, and are judging themselves or feeling down about themselves. And that idea of self-love, feeling that I'm an okay person. I'm not perfect. There are things I need to develop or change, but I'm lovable and I love myself and I want to be gentle with myself. Does that make sense?
Yes. And that's where the whole concept of affirmations and positive reaffirmations come in. People looking at themselves in the mirror and telling themselves they love them. Initially, you laugh at it, but there is something to it.
I agree 100%. And in fact, in preparing for our discussion today, I was writing down a list of what are the different things that I recommend that we do with the children we work with. And near the top of the list was positive affirmations. And I'm a big proponent of using a nighttime positive affirmation. So while the child is starting to fall asleep, when their brain goes from alpha, beta, theta in the different brain states, that they become more receptive. So playing affirmations, I'm a good person, people like me, I'm okay, I'm likable, I'm lovable, even though, again, going back to that statement, even though sometimes I mess up, even though I do something wrong, I love myself anyway. Not to go too far afield in this way, Anshu, but as an educator, someone who's worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children at a young age, these days in our society, we have such a focus on achievement for young children. We push children to be, to get on a football team at the age of 3 and to be a star. In Canada here, we try and push kids to be great hockey players so they can become a professional hockey player. Or we have little children who are learning to be, star singers and to go on, the television show to be a singer. The idea of achievement is so huge in our society and with TikTok and things. And what we're missing is teaching a child that whether you ever get chosen to be the captain of a football team or whether you ever get the best score in a mathematics exam, that you're lovable, that you're okay. And what we don't teach children
to be content
is how to have
within themselves.
Right? Exactly. Is how do you have a good relationship to yourself? All of us have a relationship to ourselves. We're very focused on relationships with others. What do other people think? How many friends do I have? But what we don't teach is a basic relationship to yourself. What language do you use for yourself? When you lose your car keys, and I'm talking about myself now, when I lose my car keys on the way out the door to an important meeting, do I say to myself, oh, Jonathan, you're so stupid. You always, you're so, why are you so dumb? And if that's the language I'm saying to myself, that's the relationship I'm having with myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
If I could just share, years ago in my sort of mid-20s, when I was doing a lot of training in the field of autism and psychology, I had a very insightful trainer who pointed out to me how critical I was being of myself. And we had a number of very important talks, at least they were important for me. And while I was focused outwardly on trying to be a great autism therapist and a psychologist and a parent coach, this trainer encouraged me. She said, Jonathan, for the next while, I want to encourage you to really work on the relationship you have with yourself. And it got me thinking at that time. I remember I was almost stunned thinking, I don't know a thing about the relationship with myself. I've never thought about that. And she pointed out this example, and which has stuck with me to this day. She said, Jonathan, if a little child lost one of their crayons or couldn't find a toy, let's say a 3 or 4-year-old couldn't find their toy car or train, would you say to them, oh, you're so stupid losing your toys all the time. What's wrong with you? And I laughed out loud. I said, of course I wouldn't. I want to be caring and loving and kind and patient with the child. And she said, so why wouldn't you extend that to yourself?
Very good point.
Be patient with yourself. And it triggered such a cascade of insight that I took with me for the next years, where I began a new relationship with myself towards self-love. Just a quick example. I was working very hard at the time in an office as well, and I often would miss lunch, or I would delay lunches and snacks, and I'd work and work and work until my belly was growling because I was so driven to work. And again, my trainer at the time, who I was sharing this with, said to me, if there was a little child, a 3, a 4, or even a 7 or 8-year-old child who said, I'm hungry, would you say to them, oh, well, just wait an hour. Why don't you just wait 2 hours and not eat? It's okay. And then if they said, but my stomach is grumbling, literally growling and grumbling, would you say, well, just work another half an hour? And I said, no, I would do everything possible to get that child some food. And she said again, so why are you treating yourself any differently? So I think when we come back again to social anxiety and the way that we deal with ourselves, I don't want to suggest for a moment that social anxiety is self-imposed, but I would suggest that the way in which we treat ourselves gently or not, or the way in which we're critical with ourselves or forgiving and patient, or the way that we push ourselves, or the way that we give ourselves space to be who we are, I think all of those are very important dynamics.
That's a very, very important point, Jonathan. And through all these many podcasts that I've done, one of the very important lessons that I have learned, which you've just reinforced today, is that we all have to be kind to ourselves. We forget about being kind to ourselves. And it's this whole thing about, achievement and competition, and more achievement and more competition. And like you said, layers of it. It gets to a point which causes stress and anxiety.
Yes.
And
Yes.
for all the parents out there, I think that's a great message from you, that don't do that to yourself, because if you're doing that to yourself, sometimes the children pick it up without even
Yes.
realizing. So thank you for that very, very important message. And I end every podcast with a rapid fire round to summarize the podcast. So here goes. An exercise that children with social anxiety can start today.
Well, I would say teaching them to not judge themselves when they fail or they don't do something right. So the exercise is really teaching them to immediately say, it's okay. Even though I feel nervous, I accept myself anyway. Or even though I colored outside of the lines, I tried my best. So this idea of being gentle and forgiving with yourself, that's the exercise. That's the lesson.
Lovely. One specific therapy method parents must look into for social anxiety.
I would say emotional freedom technique, EFT or tapping, and for the parents to use it for themselves first, because there's often a lot of frustration and even anxiety of the parent as they see their child suffering or going through this. So emotional freedom technique for the parents, and then using it with the child.
Wonderful. An unmissable sign that a child is experiencing social anxiety.
Yes. So actively avoiding or refusing to go to social events that they previously enjoyed, or avoiding and not being able to do just basic daily living tasks and routines. Those are some big red flags.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was such an incredible chat. I hope we help lots and lots of people with that chat. Thank you for taking the time and for your powerful insights.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
To those listening, I hope you learned something new today, and I hope we brought you a little closer to leading a healthier, happier, more hopeful life. Please do subscribe to our channel. As I've said many, many times, this enables us to get you lots of speakers and provide you this episode for free. And I would love to hear from you. So please send me an email at anshu@wellnesscurated.life with any topic suggestions or any questions that you might have. Thank you so much, and see you next week.